In the quiet dawn of the medieval world, when the mist still clung to valleys, and the seas carried whispers of forgotten empires, a city of stone and gold rose where continents touched and history refused to die. Constantinople stood at the edge of Europe, and Asia wrapped in salt wind and prayer bells, its walls glowing pale pink under the first light of morning while fishermen hauled their nets from the Bosphorus and monks murmured psalms that echoed through marble halls. This was not Rome yet. It carried Rome's blood in its veins. Not Greece yet spoke its tongue. Not the East yet ruled with its patience. As wooden carts creaked over cobbled streets, and bakers pulled round loaves from stone ovens filling the air with warm grain and smoke, the Byzantine Empire awakened again, as it had done for centuries. Traders from Syria adjusted their wool cloaks against the cold, while armorers struck iron on anvils, sending sharp metallic rings through narrow alleys, and somewhere behind towering walls, scribes dipped quills into ink, preserving laws, rituals, and memories that the rest of the world had already lost. This empire did not survive by accident. It survived by watching, by adapting, by bending without breaking, while others shattered. Its emperors wore silk robes, heavy with gold thread, yet ruled from palaces that smelled of candle wax, incense, and damp stone. They governed through ceremony, diplomacy, and patience, knowing that survival was not won only on battlefields but in treaties, in marriages, in secrets whispered behind carved doors. Outside the capital, the empire stretched across rugged mountains, olive groves, and wind-swept plains where farmers broke frozen soil with wooden plows and prayed for mild winters, while forts crowned hilltops like clenched fists against the horizon. Here, survival meant storing grain, sealing wells, repairing walls before the snow fell, and teaching children to read both scripture and warning signs of war. Every sunrise carried uncertainty, yet the empire endured because it remembered what others forgot: how to preserve roads, how to tax trade, how to build domes that seemed to float on light, and how to turn knowledge into armor stronger than steles. Torchlight flickered against ancient stone inside Constantinople's walls. The empire listened to the world beyond its gates, hearing the hoofbeats of invaders long before they arrived. Goths, Huns, Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, each came believing the city would fall, as Rome once had, yet each met layers of stone, cunning, and fire. Greek fire burned upon the sea, clinging to wood and flesh alike, lighting the night with terror, while chain barriers closed harbors like iron jaws. The empire survived sieges, not only through weapons but through organization, through granaries carefully measured, through aqueducts humming with water, through hospitals where surgeons cleaned wounds with wine, and knowledge passed down from Galen and Hippocrates. In monasteries tucked into cliffs, monks ground pigments, copied manuscripts, and kept alive the memory of science, philosophy, and law, while much of Europe slept in shadow. Winter winds howled across Anatolia, rattling shutters and carrying the smell of pine smoke, as villagers huddled around hearths, telling stories of emperors, saints, and cities that never fell. Bells rang in churches, whose mosaics shimmered like captured sunlight, depicting saints with solemn eyes, reminding all who entered that endurance was sacred. The Byzantine world was one of contrasts, where silk caravans crossed paths with barefoot pilgrims, where court intrigue lived beside daily prayer, where survival meant choosing patience over pride and strategy over glory. And as centuries passed, like slow turning pages, the empire shrank, then held, then adapted again, becoming leaner, sharper, more defensive, yet still alive. Each generation inherited walls worn smooth by time and repaired them, stone by stone, believing that as long as Constantinople breathed, the world still had a memory of Rome. This was an empire that survived by thinking in centuries, not seasons, by trusting stone, ink, and ritual as much as sword and shield. And in this quiet, yet relentless endurance, the story of 1,000 years began, not with conquest, but with the simple act of refusing to disappear. The sun climbed higher over the empire. The true strength of Byzantium revealed itself, not in banners or marching armies, but in the quiet rhythm of daily order that held chaos at bay. Within the great palace, courtiers moved through echoing corridors of polished stone, their footsteps softened by woven carpets from Anatolia, while eunuchs guarded doorways heavy with bronze fittings and carved crosses. Every gesture, every bow, every word followed ancient protocol, because order itself was a weapon. Emperors ruled from behind veils of ceremony, presenting themselves as chosen by God, yet surrounded by advisors, scribes, and generals who measured threats with cold precision. Maps were unrolled across cedar tables showing rivers, mountain passes, and distant deserts where enemies might rise. Gold coins stamped with sacred images moved from hand to hand, buying peace one year, alliances the next, while spies crossed borders dressed as merchants, monks, or pilgrims carrying whispers back to Constantinople. This was an empire that fought wars without always drawing swords, understanding that survival depended on knowing when to resist and when to endure. Beyond the capital, provincial towns stirred with life as blacksmiths shaped horseshoes and plow blade sparks, flying like fireflies in dim workshops, while women dyed wool with crushed plants and children chased chickens through muddy courtyards. The smell of olive oil, leather, and smoke clung to everything as bells marked hours for work and prayer. Fortified towns repaired their walls each spring, lifting stones worn smooth by centuries, because memory taught them that neglect invited disaster. Byzantine survival was built on administration that reached into every village, counting harvests, storing grain, and ensuring that when famine came, it did not come alone, but met resistance in full. Granaries and guarded roads in distant frontiers where mountains cut the sky and winds carried snow, even in summer. Soldiers manned watchtowers, scanning horizons for dust clouds that signaled invasion. Their cloaks pulled tight against the cold, their shields scarred and repaired again and again. These men were not conquerors chasing glory, but guardians holding lines drawn by history. Supply wagons creaked along Roman roads, still intact because Byzantium understood maintenance as survival. Bridges were rebuilt, baths repaired, and aqueducts cleared of debris so water continued to flow through stone veins of the empire. In cities, artisans cut marbles, set mosaics, and raised domes that seemed to defy gravity, light pouring through narrow windows to dance on gold tesserae. Churches filled with incense and chanting became anchors of identity, reminding people who they were when borders shifted and armies passed through. Monasteries became islands of calm, where the scratching of quills replaced the clash of steel, and ancient texts were preserved, line by line. Philosophy, medicine, astronomy, saved not for glory, but for necessity. When plague swept through streets, hospitals organized care, isolating the sick, cleaning wounds and recording symptoms, learning through suffering, while elsewhere fear ruled unchecked. Merchants returned from distant lands, bringing silk, spices, and stories of new powers rising beyond the horizon, and the empire listened, adapting its defenses, laws, and diplomacy with each report. Winter storms battered the coast's, waves slamming against harbor walls, while sailors secured ropes and prayed for dawn, knowing that trade was lifeblood as vital as grain. Through intrigue, betrayal, reform, and renewal, Byzantium survived by refusing to stagnate, reshaping itself generation after generation, shedding excess, clinging to what worked, and letting go of what did not. Every child born within its borders inherited not just land or faith, but a lesson written into stone and ritual, that endurance required patience, discipline, and memory. And as centuries unfolded like heavy tapestries, the empire continued its quiet defiance against time, standing not as the strongest or largest, but as the most prepared to outlast the storm. As centuries pressed forward like an unrelenting tide, the Byzantine Empire learned that survival was not only a matter of walls and wisdom, but of faith deeply woven into every breath of life. At dawn, church bells rolled across cities and valleys, their sound mixing with the call of merchants, opening shutters, and the lowing of cattle in fields beyond the walls. Incense drifted through vast basilicas, where mosaics watched silently from golden heights, saints, emperors, and angels, frozen in time, as living witnesses to endurance. Religion was not merely belief, but structure binding the empire together, offering meaning in hardship and order in uncertainty. Emperors were crowned beneath towering domes, their heads bowed as patriarchs placed heavy crowns upon them, reminding all that power answered to heaven as much as earth. This fusion of throne and altar strengthened loyalty, yet also sparked conflict as debates over icons shook cities and split families. Streets once filled with prayer echoed with argument as images were torn from walls and later restored, proving that even faith could become a battlefield. Yet through these storms, Byzantium adapted again, learning that survival sometimes meant compromise, sometimes patience, until unity could be restored. Beyond the capital, rural life continued beneath wide skies. Farmers rose before light-breaking frost-hardened soil with iron-tipped tools, their breath clouding in the cold, while women kneaded dough by hearth fires, the smell of bread spreading through wooden homes as a promise of another day endured. Seasonal rhythms shaped existence, harvests, feasts, fasts, and winters of hunger, teaching resilience more effectively than any law cross. The empire's cultural brilliance flourished not as luxury, but as shield. Scholars studied stars to calculate calendars, ensuring festivals aligned with seasons, while engineers refined techniques for building arches, domes, and defenses that could withstand earthquakes and sieges alike. The empire inherited Roman law and reshaped it, creating codes that governed marriage, property, and trade, bringing stability to lives often threatened by war. In bustling markets, languages blended, Greek, Latin, Arabic, Slavic, as traders weighed spices and coins rang against stone counters, while storytellers spoke of distant lands where new powers rose and old ones faded. Music echoed through taverns and palaces alike, lyres and chants carrying emotion where words failed. Silk workshops hummed with quiet labor hands, guiding threads into patterns prized across continents, funding armies, walls, and diplomacy. Yet danger never slept at the borders, as rival empires tested defenses again and again, forcing Byzantium to remain vigilant, flexible, and sometimes ruthless. Fortresses were repaired, rebuilt, and abandoned as frontiers shifted and commanders learned to fight defensively, using terrain, weather, and timing to offset numerical disadvantage. Snow-covered passes became allies, while narrow valleys turned ambush into art. Soldiers trained not for glory but for endurance, learning to hold lines, retreat, and return stronger. As night fell, torches lit streets, casting long shadows across stone and plaster, while guards called out hours from towers, their voices steady against the darkness. Families gathered around hearths, sharing stories of saints, heroes, and emperors, teaching children that survival was heritage passed through blood and memory. Plague, famine, and war tested this resolve, yet each time, the empire adapted, recording lessons, preserving knowledge, rebuilding what was lost. Monasteries stored grain during lean years, opening their doors when villages suffered, proving that faith also meant action. Travelers arriving at Constantinople marveled at a city still alive, still ordered, while others lay in ruin. Its harbors crowded, its markets loud with life, its walls standing as monuments to patience. Byzantium survived not by denying change, but by absorbing it, filtering threats into strengths and turning adversity into continuity. Through belief, culture, law, and daily labor, the empire held fast against time itself, and in doing so carried the ancient world forward into an uncertain future, refusing to let memory die even as centuries weighed heavy upon its stones. As the world beyond Byzantium shifted and hardened, the empire found itself surrounded by rising powers whose hunger for land, faith, and glory pressed against its borders like gathering storms. To the east, deserts breathed out armies, shaped by new beliefs, swift and relentless, while to the west fractured kingdoms slowly awakened, remembering roads, laws, and ambitions, once borrowed from Constantinople. Yet within the empire life continued, with measured resolve, as diplomats rode out beneath banners trimmed in gold, carrying gifts of silk icons and carefully chosen words. Negotiation became an art equal to war for Byzantium, understood that a treaty signed in candlelit halls could save more lives than 1,000 swords. Inside the city, the Senate chamber echoed with debate, voices rising beneath vaulted ceilings as officials weighed tribute against bloodshed, knowing that survival sometimes meant paying today to endure tomorrow. Outside the walls, craftsmen repaired armor, reforged blades, and patched shields, not for conquest, but for defense, while shipwrights labored in harbors, shaping hulls from seasoned timber, the smell of pitch and salt thick in the air. War galleys slid into the Bosphorus, their oars creaking like living things, ready to defend the lifeline of the city. Greek fire remained a whispered terror, its formula guarded with lives, as sailors trained to unleash it upon enemy fleets, turning water itself into flame. Constantinople, the empire, grew leaner, yet sharper, as provinces once vast became precious anchors of survival. In Anatolian villages, bells rang warning of raids, sending families rushing behind walls with what they could carry: grain, children, icons, and hope. Fortresses became havens where soldiers and civilians shared cramped spaces, listening to winter winds batter stone while fires burned low to conserve wood. Commanders relied on scouts and signal fires flickering across mountain ridges, relaying danger faster than riders could travel. The empire no longer sought expansion but mastery of endurance, adapting its strategies to preserve what remained. Emperors understood that survival demanded reform, reducing excess, streamlining armies, and rewarding loyalty with land and titles, binding defenders to the soil they protected. Monasteries trained not only monks, but scribes, administrators, and healers, ensuring that knowledge continued to circulate even as resources dwindled. Education remained prized because memory was the empire's strongest wall. As centuries narrowed Byzantium's horizons, Constantinople itself grew denser, louder, more alive, as refugees flooded in, bringing skills, stories, and scars from lost lands. Markets overflowed with accents and desperation, yet also innovation, as newcomers introduced techniques in farming, weaving, and trade, strengthening the city's resilience. Church domes echoed with prayers layered thick with fear and gratitude, while processions wound through streets carrying relics believed to shield the city from doom. Festivals continued, despite hardship, reminding all that identity survived, even when territory did not. Winter nights grew harsher, food scarcer, yet systems of rationing and storage prevented collapse, as granaries were guarded like treasures, and bread was distributed with careful fairness. The empire endured siege after siege, learning to live under pressure, its people growing accustomed to distant drums and the sight of enemy banners beyond the walls. Children learned early to recognize danger, and adults learned patience as a virtue forged by necessity through diplomacy, resilience, and relentless adaptation. Byzantium transformed from an empire of ambition into a fortress of memory, guarding the inheritance of the ancient world. Each stone repaired, each manuscript copied, each child taught to read became an act of defiance against oblivion. The empire stood smaller yet unbroken, defined not by the lands it lost, but by the spirit it preserved. And as time marched forward with unfeeling weight, Byzantium continued to breathe, pray, and endure, holding fast to the belief that survival itself was victory even when the world believed the end was near. As the final centuries unfolded like a long fading twilight, the Byzantine Empire stood weary yet unbowed, its survival no longer measured in vast territories, but in the beating heart of Constantinople itself. The city rose each morning beneath pale skies, its domes catching fragile light, while cracked walls were patched again by hands that had done so all their lives. Bells rang softer now, yet still rang, calling the faithful, reminding them that endurance had not yet ended. Within narrow streets, vendors sold bread, olives, and thin wine, their voices echoing between stone buildings, worn smooth by 1,000 years of footsteps. Children played beside ancient columns, scavenged from fallen temples, unaware that they lived among the last guardians of a world almost gone. Inside palaces once filled with splendor, emperors ruled with limited power, yet unbroken dignity, wearing robes heavy with symbolism, if not wealth, presiding over ceremonies that preserved continuity, even as resources dwindled. Scholars continued to teach, copying texts by flickering lamplight, preserving law, theology, and philosophy, while the sound of distant cannon sometimes rolled across the land, signaling a new age pressing closer. Yet the city did not surrender its identity easily, for Byzantium had learned that survival was also memory and meaning. Torchlight flickered against ancient stone in these final years. The empire gathered itself not in despair, but in quiet resolve. Monks chanted in echoing churches, their voices rising beneath domes that had seen coronations, miracles, and bloodshed alike. Mosaics still shimmered, saints gazing down with calm eyes, as if reminding all who entered that empires could fall, yet faith endured. Blacksmiths worked late, hammering metal into hinges, arrowheads, and tools, the ring of iron against iron sounding like a heartbeat, refusing to stop. Fishermen still cast nets into the Bosphorus. At dawn, salt spray on their faces, hauling in silver catches that fed families and soldiers alike. Women ground grain, baked bread, and tended gardens within city walls, coaxing life from thin soil as winter winds swept in from the sea. This was survival reduced to essentials, stripped of excess yet rich in meaning, shaped by centuries of endurance. When the final siege came, it did not arrive as surprise, but as a culmination felt in the bones of the city. Defenders manned walls worn smooth by time, clutching weapons, old and new, eyes fixed on horizons dark with banners and smoke. Prayers mixed with commands as bells rang and drums answered from the enemy camps beyond. Cannon thundered, shaking stone and spirit alike, yet the city stood defiant, its people drawing strength from history itself, knowing they walked where emperors, saints, and scholars once stood. Even as walls cracked and towers fell, there was no erasure of what Byzantium had been, because its true legacy lived not only in stone, but in the ideas it carried forward. Roman law, Christian theology, Greek philosophy, medicine, engineering, and diplomacy, all forged, refined, and preserved within its walls, had already spread far beyond them, shaping worlds that would follow. When Constantinople finally fell, it did not vanish, but transformed. Its scholars fled, carrying books westward, its traditions flowed into new empires, its memory embedded in churches, laws, and universities, yet the end, the Byzantine Empire survived 1,000 years, not by conquering endlessly, but by adapting, remembering, and enduring, through patience, intellect, and faith. It stood as a bridge between ancient and modern worlds, guarding knowledge through darkness and passing it onward like a torch that never truly went out. As dawn broke over the city one last time, light touched domes, walls, and waters alike, revealing not defeat but completion of a long human story, written in stone, fire, ink, and prayer. Byzantium fell, yet its survival was complete, because it refused oblivion, and in doing so, ensured that even in its end, the empire would live on wherever memory, knowledge, and resilience were valued. This was the triumph of Byzantium, not in eternal rule, but in eternal influence, carried forward long after its walls had fallen and its banners had faded into history.